Hey everyone, it's Jamie Batts, your instructor for AMP2. We're continuing on with chapter 19 and talking about cardiac physiology. And in the last section, we were discussing the effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system on the heart. And I had already paused my video or stopped my video, so I didn't have these things yet. But when I stopped the video, I was thinking I could totally draw things out for that. So I have a few little visuals to help you. My handy dandy whiteboard here, and maybe I can swoosh this. Yeah, maybe that'll work. So, under here we go. Under parasympathetic, there we go. Para, just abbreviate. We have ACH acting as our neurotransmitter for that. When ACH is released, right, this is all through the vagus nerve. This is going to cause the potassium channels to open. That's going to cause a decrease in depolarization. So you can see my messy room here. Depolarization. Bloop. A decrease in depolarization. And overall, a decrease in, sorry, this is like the most awkward position ever to write in. Heart rate. Sorry, my arm's not long enough. Okay, so that's parasympathetic. With sympathetic, here, I think I'll just hold it. Might be easier. I don't know. My arms hurt. I had an arm day yesterday. So under sympathetic innervation, this is all through the cardiac plexus. In like nerve world, right? In sympathetic, we have our norepinephrine being released, right? Norepinephrine goes and activates our beta-1 receptors, not B, beta receptors. And the beta-1 receptors cause our sodium channels to open. And with those sodium channels opening, we have I'm like running out of room. That's going to cause an increase in repolarization rates. An increase in repolarization rates, basically making the heart rate increase, which is the whole purpose of sympathetic activation, because we want our heart rate to increase when we're under sympathetic activation. So let me erase this. There's one more thing I want to draw, and it's going to relate back to, I'm erasing with my hand, it's very technical. It's going to relate back to what we're about to talk about in this lecture and the upcoming lectures, just some different words there. So, but I don't think your book does a good job of painting this picture for you. So that's what I'm going to do. So this is autonomic nervous system. Right, para and just regular sympathetic. So parasympathetic and sympathetic. And very, very high quality video here. You're welcome. So under sympathetic stimulation, we have our norepinephrine. This is the same thing that we pretty much just drew out, but I'm going to add a couple new terms. We have our beta-1 receptors. We have all of these being activated is going to cause an increase in metabolism. It's kind of like the whole picture, right? Increase in metabolism. We're going to have in our heart, taking it all back to heart, it's going to increase the force of contraction. Think about what that might influence. If we increase the force of our contraction, we might increase our stroke volume, right? Stroke volume is how much blood's being pumped out every time. Increase the force. And what that's going to do is it's going to decrease something called the ESV, our end systolic volume. That's the amount of blood that's left over in the heart. So in other words, there's less leftovers, because all the blood's being pumped out because there's more force. There's more force because we have a higher metabolism, because our beta-1 receptors are activated because of norepinephrine, right? Okay. So likewise with parasympathetic, balance it on my shoulder. So with parasympathetic, this is our ACH. ACH is going to cause an inhibition. And with that, we're going to decrease the force of contraction. So if we're inhibiting our cardiocytes and we're decreasing the force of that contraction, then we're decreasing our stroke volume, which means if there's less volume being pumped out of our ventricles, that means we're going to increase our ESV, our end systolic volume, which means there's more leftovers, or in other words, less pumped out of the blood, or less pumped out of the heart. So let's move on. I'm going to introduce some more terms to you in this section, and I don't know if my drawings help you or confuse the heck out of you, but I don't know. It is what it is. So let's talk about, I think this is where we left off. Yes. So let's talk about something called stroke volume and some factors that affect our stroke volume. Remember, stroke volume is the amount of blood that is pumped out of our left ventricle with a single heartbeat. Stroke volume can be compared to like a manual pump, right? Or think of like a bike pump, right? Like pumping air into a bike tire. The amount that's pumped is going to vary with how much that pump handle can move. So even though there's two pumps, two ventricles, they really pump the same volume, right? So we're just going to talk about one pump instead of two pumps, if that makes sense. You do have technically a right and a left ventricle, but we're just going to talk about one of them. It just makes it easier. But all of these terms apply to both ventricles. So as that bike pump handle is raised, right, what's happening? The pressure in the cylinder is going to decrease. Water is going to enter through a one-way valve, and you get this kind of passive filling that occurs. So the pressure decreases because the volume is increasing, right? You're raising that handle, giving it more space, and therefore less pressure. So it's allowing it to fill with water or air or whatever, right? So at the start of the pump, at the start of the cardiac cycle, this is when the pump in the cylinder is the same thing as the blood in the heart, right? Just kind of keep in the analogy. You have what's called our EDV, or our end diastolic volume. This is the amount of blood in the ventricle after resting has occurred. So in other words, this is kind of our max capacity. This is how much blood this ventricle's going to hold, right? So that's the EDV. When that pump handle comes down, right? So go back to our pump being the ventricle, the left ventricle. The atria have just squeezed down into them, and our ventricles are now full. Now, when that pump handle, going back to our pump analogy, when that pump handle is coming down, that water is forced out, right? It's the same thing with our ventricular ejection. When that ventricle squeezes, the blood's going to come out. So when the pump handle's down all the way, what we have left, there's some still water or air left in that pump. Well, there's still blood left in the ventricle. So even after that ejection, there's a little puddle of blood at the bottom of our ventricle. It's not completely empty. That's called the ESV, our end diastolic volume. So in other words, even when you're pumping water or pumping air, there's always going to be a little bit left over. Those leftovers are called the ESV, or end systolic volume. We just drew it on that little whiteboard I just showed you. So the amount of water pumped out is equal to our stroke volume, how much blood is actually leaving the heart with that contraction. So we have a little math equation. The stroke volume is the same thing as the EDV, or our max capacity, right? How much blood we had at the beginning minus how much blood we have left over, right? That's how much blood was actually pumped out. The amount pumped out is our stroke volume. The amount we had in the beginning was our EDV, and the leftovers is our ESV. So here it is with the pump analogy. You have our filling that's occurring. we're pulling that handle up, sucking the water in. In other words, our atria are contracting, kind of topping off our ventricles. They're being filled. Now we're at max capacity. Now we have our EDV, our end diastolic volume. Our atria have contracted. Our ventricles are getting ready to contract. They haven't yet. They're as full of blood as they're ever going to be. Then they start contracting and our pump handle goes down, right? We're pumping it out. We're pumping it out of the heart and blood's coming out, or air or water's coming out of that pump. When we do that, we eventually get to the end and we have a little bit left over. The leftovers are the ESV, or end systolic volume. So let's talk about some things that affect our stroke volume. We started to think about them in the last little mini lecture that I gave. There are things that affect our stroke volume. Remember, stroke volume is the amount of blood that's pumped out of our heart, right? So things that affect stroke volume are going to be influenced by our EDV and ESV. Influences on the EDV, our venous return, how much blood we get back into the heart. If we don't get that much blood into the heart, just, through circulation, maybe it's getting hung up somewhere, well, then the ventricles aren't going to be able to fill with it, right? So the amount of blood returning to that right atrium can be affected by our overall blood volume. So if you have internal bleeding or external bleeding somewhere, obviously you're not going to be able to fill your ventricles enough because blood's leaving the body, right? Reduce muscular activity. As you change your muscular activity, how much you're moving and shaking, you're going to either bring more blood back to the heart or less blood back to the heart. Just because, again, the veins, the blood in the veins move through that skeletal muscle pump, right? Through that, just the contraction of the skeletal muscles pumping that blood back to the heart. Also, the rate of blood through the peripheral tissues. If it gets hung up somewhere, it's very slow moving in certain places. Maybe it's convoluted by lots of fat, or you got a tumor or something like that, slowing it down. That is going to influence the amount of blood coming back to the heart, that venous return. So venous return is influenced, or is going to influence our EDV. I'm not going to draw this out. I think you should draw this out, but I will instruct you in how to do it. So I would create a diagram. At the top, I would write factors affecting stroke volume. And then I would have one little branch off of it. And that one little branch would say EDV, end diastolic volume. And then a little branch off of EDV would be venous return. And then I would have 3 branches off of venous return: blood volume, muscular activity, and blood flow through peripheral tissues. That's what I would do, teaching you how to make these graphic organizers. So another thing that influences EDV, so this is another branch off of your EDV graphic organizer, filling time. So the filling time is the duration of the ventricular diastole. How long they're sitting there not contracting is when they're filling. Influenced by slowing that heart rate. The slower your heart rate is, the longer your ventricles have to fill, right? That fill time is increased. Increasing your heart rate is going to give you less fill time because it's decreasing the amount of blood that can get into the heart, therefore increasing or decreasing your EDV. So fill time is another branch, and then you can have the heart increasing and decreasing heart rate coming off of that branch of your graphic organizer. Something that also influences EDV is something called preload. Preload is the amount of stretching that occurs in your heart muscle, the myocardial stretching. So the greater your EDV, remember EDV is at max capacity, so the larger that volume is, the larger your preload. The more those ventricles are saying, whoa, we're really full, right? The more full they are, the greater your stroke volume. So the greater your EDV, the greater your preload is, the greater your stroke volume. It's actually called the Frank-Starling principle, or the Frank-Starling law. This is the idea that the more blood you have, the more blood you're going to pump out. Again, makes sense. If you fill the whole heart with blood, that you stretch that left ventricle as much as you possibly can, that left ventricle is going to have a whoosh, oomph of a force. But when it does, a lot of that blood's going to come out, and that is an increased stroke volume. So You also have increased filling. That's going to stretch the sarcomeres of your ventricular muscles to their optimum length, so they're going to contract more efficiently. When they contract more efficiently, you're going to have a more powerful contraction. When you have a more powerful contraction, you're going to eject more blood. So those are all factors that affect preload and therefore EDV and therefore stroke volume. All right. Something that influences ESV. ESV are end systolic volume. The contractility. So after ESV, remember, is the leftovers. So this is another branch off of our factors affecting stroke volume graphic organizer. ESV. Contractility affects ESV. Contractility is the amount of force that's produced during a contraction. So that is going to vary with our autonomic stimulation. It can also vary with hormones and drugs. So again, those are things that you can branch off of the word contractility. These are increased by sympathetic. Hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, thyroid hormone, and glucagon, those are all kind of metabolizing, fast, get up and going type hormones. They're reduced, autonomic stimulation is reduced by beta blockers and calcium channel blockers, right? You may know someone who is on some of these drugs because they have a heart condition. Depending on what their heart condition is, they could be on a beta blocker or a calcium channel blocker. So something else that affects ESV, the leftovers. This is another branch off of your ESV. Afterload. Remember, we had preload. Preload's the amount of stretching that occurs in the ventricle. Afterload is how much tension is needed to get that blood out of that ventricle. So the greater the afterload, the lower your stroke volume. Does that make sense? So the harder your heart has to work, the less it's going to pump out. So an increased period of volumetric contraction has to be there to build enough tension. It's going to decrease the length of ventricular ejection. So then, therefore, the less blood is ejected. So there's kind of this optimum amount of volume of blood that should go into your ventricles every time. If you have too much, you're going to have too much stretching. If you have too much stretching, you're going to have to really work to build up that pressure to get it up and out, right? So it's increased afterload. Increased afterload is going to decrease your stroke volume. Your heart's going to have to work too hard to pump all that blood out in order to build enough tension to open those semilunar valves to get the blood out of the heart. Afterload can also be increased by any factor that's restricting arterial blood flow. So if there's any type of vasoconstriction that's going on, if there are blockages in your arteries, that's going to affect your afterload. The afterload is the pressure that's needed to get the blood out of the heart. So if you have a bunch of blockages, that blood is going to get hung up on its way out of the heart, and it's not going to get where it needs to go. Your stroke volume is going to decrease because your afterload is too high. So this is, again, that water pump analogy. The EDV, this is at max capacity. Our ESV is the leftovers. The stroke volume is what is pumped out of the heart. You can pause the video here, go back and revisit these terms. We're going to keep going into the next section and look at the factors that affect cardiac output. So we looked at the factors that just affected stroke volume, the ESV and the EDV. Now we can start a whole nother graphic organizer and do factors that affect cardiac output. So cardiac output, cardiac output is influenced by stroke volume. So all those things on the last graphic organizer, if you were making it, which I hope you were, all of those things can fit into this larger graphic organizer of factors affecting cardiac output. So factors that affect cardiac output are going to depend basically on what your body is doing in terms of its metabolism. Heart failure is a condition where your heart can't meet the demands of the peripheral tissues. Maybe you have something going on in the rest of your body that's just causing your heart not to be able to pump that blood out to where it needs to go, or it's not getting back to the heart so that it can be pumped out. So cardiac output can be changed by either affecting that heart rate or the stroke volume. We've already looked at influences over stroke volume, ESV and EDV. I feel a sneeze coming on. So Sorry. This is showing you a normal range for cardiac output. People who are in better shape have a greater cardiac output, especially while they're actually working out at those maximum levels, because the greater your cardiac output, the less stress is on your heart. And if you have a decreased cardiac output, then that can lead to heart failure, where your heart is just not meeting those demands. So let's look briefly at factors that affect heart rate. There are some things that affect heart rate. Remember, cardiac output is determined by heart rate and stroke volume. So we looked at factors that affect stroke volume, our ESV and our EDV, all of those, preload, afterload, venous return, all those things. Factors that affect heart rate are things like our autonomic nervous system, sympathetic stimulation and parasympathetic stimulation. Sympathetic is going to rise it, parasympathetic is going to lower it. Body temperature and exercise. As our body temperature rises, as our exercise levels rise, our heart rate is going to increase. And hormones. Hormones, depending on what the hormone is, it's going to raise or lower your heart rate. Typically, hormones increase your heart rate, like epinephrine and thyroid hormone. So here is the flow chart, or the graphic organizer you should have drawn already. If you didn't, that's okay. Factors that affect stroke volume. So we have our ESV and our EDV in here. And if we just follow these major terms, maybe we'll start at the top and then we'll work our way down. So with exercise is one of those muscular contractions, compressing the veins, increasing our venous return. So when we increase the venous return, our stroke volume can increase. When our venous return decreases, our stroke volume decreases. So that's all going to affect our end diastolic volume. In other words, the amount of blood that is filling in our ventricle. Our EDV is going to determine the preload, how much stretching, and that preload is going to affect our ESV, how much is left over. Our ESV and our EDV determine our stroke volume. If we have a very large blood volume, or a very large reduction in blood volume because of bleeding or dehydration, right? That's going to reduce the venous return. When our venous return increases or decreases, our stroke volume can increase or decrease, right? Venous return increases, stroke volume increases. Venous return decreases, stroke volume decreases. That's going to have an influence over our EDV. If we're losing blood somewhere because we're bleeding, or we're very dehydrated, so we don't have enough water in our blood, well, then our EDV is going to be relatively low, or we just don't have that much blood to fill into the ventricles. So our EDV is going to determine the amount of preload or stretching. That is going to determine our stroke volume, and therefore the ESV, the leftovers. Same thing with blood flow. Any changes in peripheral blood flow patterns are going to increase or decrease our venous return. When our stroke volume increases, when our venous return increases, our stroke volume increases. When our venous return decreases, our stroke volume decreases. That's going to have an influence on our EDV, which therefore has an effect on our stroke volume. Autonomic nervous system, our parasympathetic is going to increase our contractility, our sympathetic is going to decrease that contractility. With the greater contractility, we're going to have a smaller ESV. If our heart is very easily excited and very quickly to contract, then we're not going to have that much left over in our blood, right? Or in our heart, rather. If we have an increased filling time, we're going to have an increase in ESV. But the longer the time period our heart has to fill, the more is going to be put into the heart, EDV, and therefore the more is going to be left over. So hormones can also increase the contractility. And with greater contractility, you have a smaller ESV. With a smaller ESV, you have a greater stroke volume. There is also vasodilation. If our peripheral arteries are dilated, that's going to decrease the afterload. Right? Remember, afterload is the amount of force that is needed in the ventricle to pump that blood out. So if we have our arteries nice and dilated and wide, our heart's not going to have to work that hard to get the blood out of the heart. It's going to increase our stroke volume and therefore the efficiency of contraction. With vasoconstriction, we're going to increase our afterload. With an increased afterload, we're going to increase our ESV, our end systolic volume. It's going to be harder for our heart to pump the blood out, and therefore our ESV is going to be greater, so our stroke volume will be greater. Stroke volume equals EDV minus ESV. And all of that influences cardiac output. Put it all together, what do you get? You get this big, crazy graphic organizer that you should now understand how to explain. Factors that affect heart rate, nervous system, body temperature and exercise, and hormones. Factors that affect stroke volume, exercise, blood volume, blood flow, nervous system, hormones, right? Contractility, vasodilation, EDV, venous return, all of those terms you should be able to link back to cardiac output. So a good practice would be to make note cards of all of these terms and see if you can link them back to cardiac output. So in other words, or even I like Post-its for things, right? Take a Post-it, take a bunch of them, right? Spread them around and see if you can link the terms back to cardiac output. Stroke volume, venous return, contractility, filling time, all of these terms, see if you can relate them back to cardiac output. What would the influence be on cardiac output of each of those terms? This is just the same stuff over and over again. Here are some questions, which I'm going to pause the video, or stop the video here rather, so that you have time to sink your teeth into all that stuff. It's a lot of physiology. I do have, no, they're not that good. I said I have some things, but there's something that I haven't already said. So stop the video here, and the next little section, we'll cover the next section of the chapter. See ya.